Peacock Redo and Other Short Stories, narrated by the author, James R. Nelson. Story number 3, Butterflies Aren't Free. This story was inspired by my novel, The Butterfly Conspiracy. Paulie DeLuca fished a bent Lucky Strike out of a crumpled pack of cigarettes and popped it into the corner of his mouth. His first day of high school, September 6, 1954, had gone better than he figured. He only had to push around a few kids before word got out not to mess with him. After the last bell rang at 3:30 p.m., he slowly started the 12-block walk back to his house alone. He wasn't in any rush to get there. The sky looked like it was about to pour down rain. A curtain of gray clouds parted, and he watched as his shadow spread out 3 feet ahead of him. While he walked along the sidewalk, he amused himself by first blowing smoke from his nose, and then in a thin, long stream from his lips. He tried a few smoke rings, but the wind wasn't cooperating. He glanced down at his shadow and cracked up at how funny it was to see the dark shape smoking. His good mood disappeared when he turned the corner, and his empty house came into view. For one fleeting moment, Paulie thought about how his mother would be waiting for him, waiting to hear how his first day of high school went. Then it hit him that she wasn't there. It had been 2 weeks since she had run off with some truck driver from Hoboken, some guy she met at work down at the dispatch office. After she left, the house had been quiet and felt empty without her. What did Hoboken have to offer that was so much better than Jersey City? Her leaving had changed everything. Instead of coming home from work now, his old man went straight to the bar. His older brother, Frankie, who was never around much either. He was always out with his friends. Paulie walked up the porch steps, fumbled for the key hidden under a cracked terracotta pot, holding a dead, dried-out geranium, and swung open the front door. The house was completely silent. A wave of sadness washed over him. It only lasted a few seconds, and then he got mad. How could his mother have left like that? Sure, his old man fell asleep in his chair almost every night after supper, but geez, what about him and his brother? He walked down a hallway to his room. He passed his parents' bedroom door and stopped. He called out his brother's name. There was no response. He wasn't home. Paulie turned and pushed open the door to their room. He walked over to his mother's side of the bed and sat down. It was faint, but he could still smell her perfume. He knew it was only a matter of time until the old man threw the sheets into the washing machine, and then his last lingering reminder of her would be gone, just like her. He walked out and quietly shut the door behind him. He continued back down the hallway toward his room, pulled out another Lucky, and glanced around before he lit it. He laughed. What an idiot. It didn't matter. Nobody cared anymore if he smoked or not. As he was about to enter his room, he heard a commotion on the front porch. The door flew open and Frankie walked in with 2 of his buddies. Hey, Paulie, you home yet? Paulie stubbed out the cigarette. Yeah? His brother swaggered down the hallway with a smug look on his face. His friend stayed near the front door watching. Why was he trying to look like such a big shot? Frankie pulled out a key and waved it in front of his face. I gotta lock you up in your room. Paulie stared at his brother for a moment. What are you talking about? Lock me up. The old man wants me to watch you because of that trouble you got into. But I'm heading out with the guys, so you need to stay put in your room until I get back. You're nuts. Nobody's locking me up. You want to bet? Frankie gave him a shove, and he stumbled backwards into his room. Frankie yanked the door shut, and the key snapped the lock in place. Paulie grabbed the doorknob and pulled. Hey, Frankie, come on, let me out. This is crazy. It's your own fault, you asshole. Why'd you go and shoot out the windows at O'Malley's house? Cost the old man plenty, so now I gotta babysit you, you big jerk. Paulie continued to pull on the door. Pop smashed my BB gun into a million pieces. Let me out. I'll see you when I get back. You go sneaking out that window, and I'll put you in the hospital. Laughter faded in the end of the hallway. The front door slammed shut, and the house got quiet again. He sat on the edge of his bed. If this was going to happen every day after school, he'd have to pull a Pop and come home just in time to go to bed, too. He looked around. What was he going to do now? He stood in front of the mirror that was mounted on top of his dresser. He pulled down a small lock of hair so that it casually dropped onto his forehead, pouted his lips, and mugged a few Marlon Brando poses. He glanced outside his window to make sure nobody was watching. Bored, he flopped back down on his bed, made a fist, and punched his pillow. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but he wasn't tired. Paulie got up, walked over to his chest, and pulled open the bottom drawer of his dresser. He stuck his hand down the middle of several layers of sweaters until his hand hit the bottom of the drawer where he stashed his collection of stolen Wink magazines. He ran his fingers along the bottom of the drawer but didn't feel anything. He stopped in a panic and muttered, "If Frankie took my magazines, I'm going to kill him." He reached down into the drawer and felt around again. His fingers hit something lying flat against the bottom. It was way too thin to be a girly magazine. He pulled it out and took it over to his desk. It was a handwritten note from his mother. "Paulie, this isn't something a 14-year-old boy should be looking at. I'm throwing this filthy trash away. I'm not saying anything about this to your father. This time, Mom." Paulie sat like a statue. His face burned. When did his mother find his magazines? He crumpled up the paper and tossed it into the garbage can next to his desk. He stepped back and sat on his bed. Are those girly magazines the last thing Ma's going to remember about me? He stepped over to the door and pulled on the knob again. The door didn't budge. He flopped back down on his bed and thought about how many ways he could kill his brother and get away with it. After plotting out the fifth idea, which involved tying Frankie's shoelaces together and pushing him down the front porch steps, Paulie sat at his desk again and stared out the window. Cars drove up and down the street in front of his house. Freedom was just beyond his window pane. Out of the corner of his eye, a flicker of metallic blue caught his attention. A brightly colored butterfly was hovering over a clump of half-dead milkweed pods. Another butterfly appeared, and then another. While he stood there, two more flew by the window. They were all bright blue except for one much smaller yellow one. They flittered about, darting in random directions, flitting from pod to pod. He followed those movements for 20 minutes before turning back to his room. He glanced over at the door. Damn Frankie. Paulie pushed his chair back, stood up, and threw himself down on his bed. Watching those butterflies flit around, going wherever they wanted, just made his confinement feel that much worse. He thought about the field trip his class had taken when he was in the 4th grade. They had gone to Central Park, and he remembered how a park ranger had showed the class how to catch and mount butterflies. He didn't remember any of them being blue, but it had been a long time ago. He curled up on his bed and fell asleep. It was dark in his room when Paulie opened his eyes. He turned toward a noise outside his door. A key slipped into the lock. After a click, his door swung open. "Hey, Rip Van Winkle, get up. I got us a pizza." Paulie sat up and rubbed his eyes. "What time is it?" "It's 9 o'clock. Sorry, I thought I'd be home before. Come on, get up. Let's eat. I'm starving." Paulie followed his brother into the kitchen. Frankie threw the pizza box down on the table and grabbed a beer out of the fridge. Paulie walked over and poured himself a glass of milk. "Are you really drinking one of Dad's beers?" Paulie asked. Frankie laughed. "Who cares? Ma ain't here. He won't even miss it." Frankie shoved a big piece of pizza into his mouth and started talking. "Hey, I'm sorry about you getting back so late." He chewed a few times. "Tell you what, if you promise not to get into trouble after school, I won't lock you up no more. How's that?" Paulie took a bite and nodded. Frankie gave him a stare. "But you get me in trouble with the old man, I'll lock you up again, and you ain't never getting out. You got that?" "Don't worry. Pa smashed my BB gun into a million pieces, remember?" He reached for his glass of milk. A noise at the front door caused them both to look down the hallway. Their father pushed open the door and stumbled. It was obvious he had had a few drinks. He turned around and held the door open. "Come on in." They watched as he guided a woman into the hallway and led her into the bedroom. "Who's that?" Paulie asked, looking over at Frankie. "I never seen her before. Must be some floozy the old man met down at Salvatore's." The next day after school, Polly returned to an empty house again. He waited for Frankie to get home, but after an hour he gave up. He poured himself a glass of milk and carried it back to his room. At his window, he looked for those blue butterflies. Sure enough, they were hovering around the milkweed just like the day before. He pulled his desk chair over to the window and watched as they slowly glided from stem to stem. He liked how their steely blue color of their wings flashed in the sunlight. They looked tough and fragile at the same time, like they were made of metal, but metal so thin, even a small gust of wind would move them around in crazy directions. He wondered what they were. What kind of name did they have? They should be called blue razor blades. Yeah, the flying blue razor blade butterflies. Polly sat and watched them until the sun had almost set. He was hungry. He remembered the rest of the last night's pizza was still in the fridge. As he walked toward the kitchen, he stopped. What was that? A noise sounded like it was coming from his parents' bedroom. Polly walked over to the door and slowly pushed it open. His old man was sitting on the edge of the bed, his face buried in his hands. Polly was surprised to see him sitting there. How long had he been home? His father either heard the door creak open or felt someone watching him. He looked up. "What the hell you looking at?" Polly stood there, not saying anything. His dad pulled out a handkerchief, wiped his face, and coughed. He looked up again and said, "What the hell do you want?" Polly walked over to his mother's side of the bed. He smelled a strong and very unfamiliar perfume. He sat down next to the old man. "You miss her?" "What?" "Mom, do you miss her?" Polly's father let out a big sigh. "Yeah, I guess I do." "Me too," Polly said, looking down at the floor. "Sometimes I just get mad." His father pushed his handkerchief deep into his back pocket, grabbed Polly around the shoulders and said, I know. It just wasn't right what she done to you kids." He stood up. "Come on, let's see what we can put together for supper." Polly watched those blue butterflies every afternoon after school for the next 2 weeks. Sunlight streamed into his window. Polly rolled over and looked at the clock. For a fleeting moment he thought he was going to be late for school, but then it dawned on him. It was Saturday morning, and he had a mission. He jumped out of bed and threw on some clothes. The kitchen was empty. He went over to his brother's bedroom and peeked in. His bed was empty. Frankie never got up early, so he probably hadn't even come home last night. Polly headed down to the corner and jumped on a bus that was headed to the city. He got off at West 33rd and 5th Avenue. A few blocks further along, he went in front of the huge Brentano's bookstore. This was where he had been coming for the past few months to steal his monthly Wink magazines. It was always exciting to be in the city, and the store was so huge he could easily grab a magazine, stuff it under his shirt, and get lost in the crowd. Today he was on a different quest. He walked around the huge store. On the 3rd floor, he spotted the biology section. He had to ask one of the clerks where to look. He probably would have never found it by himself. He marched up and down the aisles, reading each title until he found a huge book with butterflies printed on the front cover. He read the title, Kensington's Field Guide to North American Lepidoptera. It was at least 4 inches thick and must have weighed over 5 pounds. It was a lot bigger than a Wink magazine. He wondered how he was going to sneak it out of the store. Polly picked up the heavy book and carried it down to the 1st floor. He walked over to a table of discount books near the front door and dropped it on top of all the others. He turned around and slowly walked to the back of the store where the girly magazines were displayed. He looked at all of the colorful colors until he came to the Wink magazine. Nothing new. It was the same issue as the last one he had swiped 3 weeks before. He headed back to the table near the front entrance. He glanced around, grabbed the butterfly book, and pushed the heavy glass door open. He took 1 step onto the sidewalk and stopped short. A bony hand grabbed his shoulder. "What do we have here?" a voice called out. Polly turned. A tall, balding man with a long beaked nose stood over him. "Did you forget to pay for that book, young man?" He didn't reply. The clerk turned Polly around and ushered him back into the store. Well, let's see what book you found so fascinating you decided you had to steal it, the man sneered. The book was yanked out of his grasp. Butterflies? Now that's a surprise. I'd have thought it would be something like The Art of Nude Photography. We lose about 3 of those every weekend. The man grabbed the back of Polly's shirt. Come on, let's go have a talk with Mr. Brentano. Polly felt everyone in the store was staring at him as he was escorted down the busy aisle. The clerk pushed him into a smaller hallway. In front of him was a bronze sign attached to a door that read Private. His captor escorted him into a dim office filled with cigar smoke. A large man in a gray suit was sitting behind a desk. A pair of half-moon reading glasses were perched at the end of his nose. The desk was overflowing with papers and assorted books. 3 ashtrays were scattered among the clutter. All were filled to the brim with short, well-chewed cigar butts. The bony man pushed Polly toward the desk and said, "Got an interesting one here, Mr. Brentano." He tossed the heavy butterfly book onto the desk. It landed with a loud thud and knocked one of the ashtrays onto the floor. "Take it easy, Hobbs." "Now look what you've done," Mr. Brentano cried out. Hobbs scrambled over to the mess on the floor and started picking up the spilled butts. "I'm sorry, Mr. Brentano. I'll clean it up." Mr. Brentano pulled a cigar stub from the corner of his mouth and picked up the book. Kensington's Butterfly Guide. He stuck the cigar back in his mouth and asked, "Hobbs, have you got this right? The kid was really trying to steal this butterfly guidebook?" Hobbs nodded emphatically. "Sure was, Mr. Brentano. Damnedest thing I ever saw." Mr. Brentano waved his hand. "Okay, Hobbs, you can go back to the floor. Paying customers are waiting. Let me spend a little time with the lad and see what's going on here." On his way out of the office, Hobbs scowled at Polly. It was clear he wanted to be part of doling out the punishment. "Pull up a chair, kid," Mr. Brentano said. "How old are you?" 14, Polly stated, with a defiant look on his face. "So, what's the story about this butterfly book? Are you stealing it for one of your classes or something?" "Nah," Polly said. He paused. "It was for me. I just kind of like watching them." "I see." Mr. Brentano leaned back in his chair. "We're making some progress. So how was this book going to make you a better butterfly watcher?" Polly sighed. "Can I just go now? You got your damn book back." Mr. Brentano frowned. "Not so fast, young man. Doesn't work that way. Don't forget, you were caught stealing a book that retails at—" He reached over, flipped up the cover, adjusted his glasses, and read the price on the inside flap. My, this book sells for almost $20. I could easily make a call and have you escorted out of here by the police. Is that what you want?" Polly put his head down and thought about what would happen if he got into trouble again. He'd probably be locked in his room every night after school until he either dropped out or graduated. "No, I didn't think so. So let me ask you again. Why was it so important for you to steal this book?" A wave of emotion rolled over Polly. "My ma took off and my brother locked me in a room because nobody was around to keep me out of trouble, so I started watching a bunch of blue butterflies. They kind of look like metal, and I don't know what they're called, so I thought I'd get a book that would tell me. Just my luck, the only book he got was so big and heavy." Polly reached into his pocket and tossed 3 crumpled dollar bills, 2 quarters, a nickel, and 4 pennies onto the desk. "This is all I got. You can have it in your book, too." Mr. Brentano looked down at the pile of bills and change. "Are you going to call the cops?" Polly asked. "Maybe they can give me a ride home, because now I don't have enough dough to even get on the bus." Mr. Brentano scooped up Polly's money and handed it back to him. "What's your name, son?" "Polly DeLuca." "Okay, Mr. DeLuca. Where do you live?" "Over in Jersey City." Mr. Brentano leaned closer to the boy. A combination of stale cigar smoke and Vitalis hair tonic enveloped him. "Here's what I'm going to do." He picked up the book and handed it to Polly. "The book is yours.